everyone. Welcome to the May 9th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Molkowski, and we are looking back at a busy weekend in racing, of course, topped by the first jewel of the Triple Crown, the Kentucky Derby, which was run on Saturday at Churchill. And Craig, the eyes of the racing world always concentrated on the Kentucky Derby at this time of year. Everyone has their takes on it coming out of the race, so we were just talking a little bit offline. Derby week can be a little exhausting for you and I mean, there's so much conversation happening, and now we get back to Tuesday, and I have to go back and watch these trips for the race. And you want to kind of find something clever to say, but already so much has been said about the race. Let's just talk about the winner first, Mage, who put in a really impressive performance for a horse that is so lightly raced. Just the fourth start of his career. Broke slowly again, but great ride from Javier Castellano, and great to see this horse and these connections get the victory.
Yeah, it was a fun race. It wasn't fun for my pocketbook as I didn't use Mage, but he ran a cracker of a race. He ran a 124 TimeformUS speed figure, which I haven't dug in. As you said, I'm a little burnt out still, but I will eventually. It feels like that's above average to me for a Kentucky Derby. If not, it's on the higher side of average. So I thought it was a good run, particularly given what a lately raced horse Mage is. The one thing I've kind of taken out of this Derby, and I said it on Twitter, and I'm making a note for myself, is I think it's time to just throw all the old Derby maxims out the window, because I just don't think they apply anymore. The way the horses are trained is totally different, and horses like Mage can win the race. And at some point, we'll probably have a lesser lately raced horse win. It's just the way it's going these days.
100%. I wanted to touch on the same thing myself. I felt like I handicapped this Derby pretty well. Two Phils and Angel of Empire, they both ran their races. And I mean, the reason that I downgraded Mage, like a lot of people did, was basically what you said, that horses like him historically had not had a lot of success in the Derby. But I think we're starting to see a lot of these Triple Crown trends start to change as horses are campaigned differently. And horses like Mage are probably going to continue to have more success in the Kentucky Derby as connections race their horses more lightly, point for these races with lighter schedules, and Mage was able to take that step forward that some other horses in the past haven't been able to do when they're facing off against more seasoned rivals. But I also think, Craig, that we have to give the horse and the connections credit, because not every lightly raced horse can sort of run the kind of race that Mage did, break slowly, have a rider that's ready for that, adapt to it by saving ground on the inside. And obviously this race featured a very fast pace that we'll talk about a little more that certainly did favor the closers, but Javier Castellano just made every right move on this horse, saving ground early, angling off the rail around the far turn pretty early, kind of getting this horse into the clear in a confident manner, knowing that he could lose some ground and still be there at the top of the stretch and have the horse to finish, and that's exactly what happened. I mean, he was able to strike the front at the eighth pole, collaring two Phils who ran a huge race and then hold off the closers late. Really nice performance from Mage, and like I said, nice to see Javier Castellano finally get that Derby win. He's attempted so many times. Javier Castellano is the kind of jockey that if you talk to racetrackers, he's just the kind of jockey everybody likes, just a really great personality in the sport, someone who tries really hard, has a great work ethic, so great to see him get it done. The ownership group, a lot of us are familiar with, great to see them in the spotlight, and Gustavo Delgado, a trainer who doesn't have a huge stable of horses, really did things his own way, preparing this lightly raced horse for the Derby, even some unconventional workouts leading up to the race, and it all worked out for Mage.
It did. I don't have a whole lot to add. I like what you said about two Phils. I thought he ran a bang-up race. Some people argue he ran the best race, and I wouldn't particularly argue with that. I don't. I think it's kind of a toss-up. I think they both ran excellent races. Maybe two Phils beats him with different circumstances. I did want to address the speed figure. I saw a lot of people expecting the two Phils to have a bigger number on TimeformUS, which makes a lot of sense given the hot pace. The problem and the reason he doesn't, there's two reasons for it, just to clear this up. One is the distance of the race. At 10 furlongs, we just don't give as much extra credit for running fast early. The other is that the pace wasn't all that fast later on in the race. When two Phils took the lead, the pace was not that much faster than the final time figure, and that's where the majority of it's going to come from, any pace upgrades. we see the fractions in red, but they came earlier in the race. It would be like if we gave a 6 furlong race extra credit for being fast after a quarter mile or 3 furlongs. It just wouldn't make a lot of sense because a lot of horses we would give way too much extra credit. So, like I said, I wouldn't argue with anyone that said Two Phils ran a better race. It's just one of those cases where you have to temper the algorithm a bit. Or as you scroll through the Timeform US chart, you would see a lot of horses that packed it in very early in the race be rewarded when I don't think they should be.
Yeah, the Derby is just a weird race, and it kind of, the way the Derby's run, it doesn't really fit the Timeform US algorithm for mile and a quarter races. I think you'd probably agree with that, Craig. I mean, we just don't see many other mile and a quarter races that are run in the same fashion as the Derby, where you've got 20 horses, and the first quarter mile ends up being so fast, and then they naturally do start to slow down around the clubhouse turn and on the backstretch, and that's typically when you see the field start to bunch up in the Derby and the traffic jam situation start to get created. But that first quarter mile, I know that we're not typically taking that into the consideration in the algorithm because in most mile and a quarter races, the first quarter mile just doesn't matter that much. So we want the algorithm to fit every mile and a quarter race, but maybe it doesn't fit the Derby that well because the Derby is just such a unique race. And I think it's fair to say that Two Phils ran the best race. No doubt about that. I mean, he was right behind that very fast opening quarter mile and also the half. And I think the Timeform US pace figure, the first one that you see in the chart, the 155 for Two Phils, that is the half mile fraction. I think you can correct me if I'm wrong about that, Craig. And that's a fast number. Is it fast historically for the Derby? It's probably right in line with some fast paces that we've seen in the past. I was going back to compare this chart to the one from last year, where I know Epicenter got a lot of accolades for his trip in the Kentucky Derby, and I would say it was a different kind of situation. The pace was faster in 2022 in the sense that the leaders set that crazy fast opening quarter, then slowed down considerably after that. And Epicenter was much farther off that suicidal pace than Two Phils was this year, but Two Phils also moved a little bit sooner. Different race, different horse. I don't think you can just lay them on top of each other and say they were the same kinds of performances. And, Two Phils struck the front maybe earlier than Jareth Loveberry really wanted to do, but I still thought that he gave this horse a perfect ride. I mean, he seized the opportunity when he needed to, and that's what you have to do in the Derby. When the hole's open, you just have to go for it, because sometimes if you wait, you can really get yourself into trouble in a race like the Derby when horses are just going to stop on a dime. So I thought that the riders on the first two finishers really just did everything right, and the result was the result.
Yeah, no argument with the algorithm. The one thing I would say is the race being different. I think it almost works by accident, and that in a huge field like this, maybe even with a fast pace, being up towards the front is more of an advantage than in the typical race. But again, it's just a unique race. So it's the final time was good. It was a good fast race, strong pace. I think the top three all ran well. We haven't mentioned Angel of Empire. He was aided by the pace a bit, but he ran very well in here, as even the fourth place finisher ran okay. But really, it was a pretty big gap between third and the rest.
Yeah, something we talked about in the Timeform US forecast last week was that there were going to be horses coming into this Derby, just given how lightly raced they are, that would take another step forward in the race. And I think we saw a few of them did, especially the top three finishers. They stepped up into that 120 plus Timeform US speed figure range, and others did not. And that's why I don't think it's really fair to say that, oh, Forte would have definitely won this Derby just because Mage won. Things don't work that way in racing. I mean, just look at the other horse coming out of the Florida Derby, Cyclone Mischief. He was last in this race. So, I mean, you can't just say, oh, the Florida Derby was the best prep just because Mage won. Mage took a step forward to win this race, as did Two Phils, who was second, as did Angel of Empire, and we don't know if Forte would have done that. So I don't think it's fair that a lot of people are saying, oh, this Derby needs an asterisk just because Forte was scratched the morning of the race. He would have been the Derby winner. Racing's not that simple.
No, and many of us, I don't remember exactly what we said about it, but you could argue Mage ran a better race in the Florida Derby, so there's nothing to say Forte would have been able to beat him here, and the asterisk talk is just silly. They ran the race, the best horse won, and it would have taken a Herculean effort from Forte based on his previous numbers, and I'm not sure it was coming, but it's all speculation, and the best horse won, and he deserves everything he gets.
And before we wrap up the Derby, just want to mention a few other horses. You already talked about Disarm, who I thought ran pretty well to be fourth in this race. Hit Show was a horse that a lot of people haven't talked about, but he wasn't that far off that early pace. I mean, he was sixth early, just a couple lengths off Two Phils, and while he was never really in the mix to win the race, he just kept staying on at one pace. Maybe a horse that you'd like to see run back at the Belmont Stakes. It was a respectable showing from Derma Sotogake, the Japanese horse. Another horse who just did not get off to the start that I think his connections were hoping for, or his backers were hoping for, just kind of got sandwiched between horses after breaking a step slowly, and he was sort of out of position the entire race, tried to make a middle move, but then kind of paid the price for that at the end. He didn't really have a whole lot of finish. Ray's Kane ran a lot better than I expected him to. He was never really in the mix, but he did kind of get sawed off in the middle of the stretch there. Again, he was never going to finish in the money, but did have a bit of trouble in the running. And Craig, Tapit Trice, a horse that ran the kind of race that I think I expected him to run, and I know some of his backers were afraid that he might run, just got off slowly, didn't react well to the kickback and the traffic, and just kind of never really got into top gear.
No, he didn't at all. I guess he's already being pointed to the Belmont, which makes sense. The Preakness probably wouldn't turn out any better for him. I agree with you about Hit Show. He was a horse we talked about in the Wood that I think we both expected to get back to his faster race before that and improve, which he did a little bit. Burma Sotogake, I was a little worried as a horse that I picked when I started hearing all the pre-race interviews that they kept harping on Christophe Lemaire going too fast last time, and I guess once he got off, it really didn't matter because the break kind of did him in. But I was a little nervous about him anyway. It seemed like they were going to take back. So I thought he ran okay. I mean, he finished, what, sixth, I believe it was, beaten half dozen lengths or so, maybe a little more. But he ran okay and wasn't embarrassed by any stretch. I think the only other one I wanted to mention, I can't remember if you did now, was Confidence Game. He was a horse I didn't like at all in here. I thought he ran pretty well also, being up close to the stretch. Not obviously never going to hit the board, but better than I thought he would. And he definitely had some traffic trouble in addition to the pace.
Totally agree with that. I'm glad you brought up Confidence Game because he's a horse, one of the few horses that might actually run back in the Preakness. And I brought this up the other day on social media, Craig, and I predictably got a lot of backlash for it, suggesting that the current Triple Crown might be something that needs to be rethought. And, there are a lot of traditionalists out there that, just scoff at the idea that we'd ever change the Triple Crown and find it offensive that anybody would even bring it up. And I understand. I used to have that belief myself, but maybe I'm a few years ahead of more people getting onto this, but it just feels like the way that the sport is going and connections are campaigning their horses, that we're just going to keep seeing less and less of horses wanting to run back in the second and third legs of the Triple Crown. And we're seeing it the past few years in the Preakness. I mean, in prior seasons, it would be a no-brainer that a horse like Two Phils would run back in the Preakness, but we see announced last night that his trainer Larry Velli just said 2-week turnaround, that's too much for me, so we're not going to compete in the Preakness. A lot of these other Derby contenders are not going to come back for the Preakness, and we always see some drop-off, but it just feels like the drop-off year after year is getting more and more pronounced, and I was actually doing a little bit looking to make sure that I wasn't just, misremembering the data to see if, horses were coming back in these second and third legs the Triple Crown less and less. And, I pulled the numbers for the past 10 years. And I mean, the decline has been gradual, but it's unmistakable. There's just been less and less participation in these traditional Triple Crown races. And you really see the drop off start to get more pronounced after that 2020 pandemic year, 2021 and 2022. And now it seems like it's going to happen again in 2023, where you just don't have these horses running in consecutive legs of the Triple Crown. And maybe the Triple Crown is just going to, continue to be this thing of the past that some respect and some don't. But I think if we want the Triple Crown to stay relevant, like a lot of other things in this sport, we have to start to be a little bit more flexible with the way that we're thinking about the traditions in our sport and maybe, open our minds to some innovation in the future.
The way I look at it, virtually everything has changed in this sport since I started following it. So many races used to be run at much longer distances. They're run at shorter distances now. There was no Breeders' Cup. Other races were more important than what they are now. It's just, I mean, there's so many things that could go on and on. if trainers aren't going to run their horses back in 2 weeks or then in another 3 weeks in the Belmont, there's really nothing we can do about it. You can't make owners and trainers run the horses. So I think you have to kind of try to accommodate them if you want to keep the races as strong as they could be. And I think it's pretty clear the Preakness is not. It's not what it once was. We get the Derby winner usually, though we didn't even get that last year. That was kind of a warning sign in and of itself. And then we never seem to get like the 2, 3, 4 finishers. Maybe we get a couple horses that the connections think they had excuses in the Derby, didn't really run much, finish far back, and then we get a bunch of new shooters. So I'm sure that the Preakness, the people at Pimlico would be open. I would hope they would be open to pushing it back a few weeks and kind of getting the race back up to the luster it once had because it's not there right now. It's the Derby winner and then everyone else. And the Belmont, this is kind of the same thing. We seem to get specialist horses, horses that don't have no speed, but that don't have much speed. For the most part, we're not getting the best 3-year-old show up in the Belmont either. So I don't want to make it pretend like it's just the Preakness. And at this point, I don't see where a change could hurt because things are definitely not moving in the right direction.
Yeah, I mean, I looked up the numbers this morning and did, average the past 10 years, not counting 2020, of course, which was not the traditional Triple Crown format, but going back to 2012 until 2022, an average of 4.4 horses from the Kentucky Derby skipped the Preakness and run in the Belmont every year, and 4.2 horses from the Derby run back in the Preakness. Now, that might not sound like a big difference. It's almost the same with the Belmont having the slight edge, but keep in mind that they're skipping a race at the Derby distance thereabouts, a mile and 3/16, to try a race at a mile and a half, which most connections never want to run in, and they're still running in that race at a higher rate than the Preakness, and I'll say those numbers go even more in favor of the Belmont if you just look at the past 5 years, but they're still running in the Belmont more, even though it's a mile and a half race. And that's because there's more space between the races. That just seems plainly apparent to me that it's the 2-week turnaround that is preventing connections from running back in the Preakness. I think something that a lot of people miss in this conversation is the Triple Crown would almost certainly get harder to win if the races were more spaced out because the quality of each race would go up a little bit more and there'd be a larger window of time for top 3-year-olds to maybe get in a Triple Crown start even if they don't run in the Derby. I mean, right now a horse has to really be good between the beginning of May and the beginning of June if they're going to make a start in the Triple Crown, but if you broaden that 1 month gap to 2 months and you have 4 or 5 weeks between each of the races, then you're going to have more participation from race to race and maybe even more late developing horses that can make a start in the Triple Crown in a Triple Crown race, and that's just going to make it a lot tougher to win. And some people might say the Triple Crown doesn't need to get tougher, it's already tough. Well, I think we're seeing that it's becoming really easy for a Derby winner to win the Preakness. We've seen it happen a lot over the past 10, 20, 15, 20 years, just because the quality of the Preakness tends to dip so much. And, they don't always complete the Triple Crown in the Belmont, but I mean, we've seen it happen quite a bit. We've seen it come close quite a bit. So I think it's something that, racing fans should be more open to. And I mean, whether it actually happens, it's all dependent on tracks cooperating and track executives actually thinking that there's a problem. And, maybe they don't think there's a problem if business is strong in the Triple Crown. But as a fan, I certainly want to see these races be of the highest quality they possibly can be, and it just doesn't feel like we're heading in that direction.
Yeah, the only other thing I want to add is with the Preakness, I've seen a lot of people saying that the Derby, the success of the Derby winner in the Preakness many years shows that horses don't need a lot of time to recover and that it's all trainers. I don't agree with that. There was a time I probably did agree with that. But what I would say is for one race, sure, horses can come back in 2 weeks. It's not that big of a deal. The problem is when you keep doing it and you make them come back in 3 weeks for the Belmont, there's just going to be a lot of attrition. 3-year-olds, they're fragile. You see a lot of horses who can't even hold up to just making the Derby. You can look through charts from years past of the Kentucky Derby and try to see what happened to many of the also rans. And basically, none of them are ever heard from again or have very underwhelming careers going forward because it's just a tough grind on these horses. So I also think spreading it out, maybe it helps keep some of these horses around a little bit and not be so worn out by the end of the Derby. And then if they do go on and compete in other races, it gets even worse.
And Craig, before we get into the rest of this rundown, which I promise we're going to get to eventually, we're going to talk about more races than the Derby. I think that point that you just brought up does kind of lead us into a topic of discussion that we need to at least address. That is the horse deaths at Churchill Downs this past week. And I don't think you can talk about this idea that the Triple Crown is a real test of horses' durability and, ability to overcome adversity without, at least bringing up this topic of, are we already being too tough on these horses? And is that the perception from the rest of the general public that, these horses are performing for our pleasure and we don't care about them? And, I watched a lot of TV. I was at my father's place watching the Derby this past week, and I saw some local news coverage and some generic nationwide news coverage. And every spot that I saw on the Kentucky Derby, whether it was 30 seconds or a minute, maybe 25% was on the Derby winner, and 75% of that spot was about the horse deaths or Saffie Joseph. And that's a real problem for our sport. And I think, so many of us want to cling to this idea of let's get back to the way things were in the past. Well, maybe that's not what the rest of the world wants to see from horse racing if they're going to allow us to continue. So I think people have to be a little bit more open that to survive, things need to change.
Yeah, there's no doubt. Now, one thing, I mean, let's be clear, you're never going to stop having horse deaths if you're going to race them. And I know you know that. That's just for people listening out there. But it can be limited to an extent. And we've seen that happen at a lot of places. Santa Anita was having big problems. They put in a bunch of new protocols, and it has went way down. So there are things that can help. They'll never be totally eliminated. It was an unfortunate week at Churchill because I think the combined Saffie Joseph issue and the horses breaking down on the track are being lumped together when really they're two completely different things. The Saffie Joseph one is obviously bad. I mean, we don't know what happened. I suspect it's not going to be good. I mean, he was suspended from all Churchill properties indefinitely until the investigation's done. Breakdowns, I mean, even if you have, I think I've seen, I forget what the statistics are. Maybe it's less than 2 for every 1,000 starts. If you have that and you run a race a week like you did in the Derby, there's every possibility that just through randomness, you're going to have more than you normally do because there's going to be times where you go weeks or months or, maybe a couple months. I've seen whole meets that didn't have a catastrophe during racing. It's just the way it's going to be, unfortunately, but we do have to do what we can to limit it. Because as you say, I saw the same exact things everywhere you turned, even in, I still get the print newspapers to kind of show you how old I am. There was an article in there all about the deaths this weekend, and it's kind of disheartening because the people writing about it generally don't know what they're talking about when it comes to horse racing, but they do know that horses died, and in today's, and really it never should have been, but in today's day and age, that's just not going to be acceptable. So it really needs to be limited as much as possible.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, Craig. I want to tie it back to that conversation we were just having about, people wanting to see these horses race more. We all want to see better competition, but I feel like you can't have it both ways. You can't say that, oh, these horses need to be pushed past their limits more, and also, oh, we want to prioritize the safety of the horses and the integrity of the sport. Those things, they don't always cooperate. And one of the trainers that a lot of that camp praises for continuing to run horses in every leg of the Triple Crown, and one of the few trainers when I was looking at my data that, would actually run horses in the Derby, Preakness, and Belmont every year, is one of the trainers that actually lost a horse this week due to a breakdown. So, and has a reputation for that. So, I don't know if we can praise that and also say that we're prioritizing the safety of the horse. There's like a disconnect there. So I think people need to be a little bit more open to change in this sport, even when it comes to the Triple Crown. And, I completely agree with what you said about the randomness factor. It's unfortunate what happened at Churchill Downs this week, and a lot of people are going to want to point fingers. A lot of people were pointing fingers at the dirt surface, even though some horses didn't even have breakdown, or the Saffie Joseph deaths weren't even on the dirt. There were all different situations, and it was just probably some randomness that it all happened the same week. And even with the heightened veterinary standards that horses had to pass to get into the Kentucky Derby this week, there were issues. So it's an unfortunate situation. It's terrible that it happened this week of all weeks. But sometimes when these things do happen, it can be the impetus for greater change, greater reforms in the sport. So hopefully something good comes out of it.
Yeah, last thing for me on this, and we can get back to racing and the rundown. Just think about if something like Barbaro or Charismatic were to happen now. Not that Charismatic died, but it was a bad look at the time. Barbaro obviously didn't wind up all that well. It didn't wind up well at all. If that happened now, if you think this weekend was bad, imagine what it would be like if something like that were to recur again. And spacing the races, I think, would certainly help avoid that.
Let's move on to the Kentucky Oaks, the feature race from that Friday card. And Craig, we've been pretty hard on this crop of 3-year-old fillies. They have not been running the fastest speed figure, at least through the preps. And I will give them credit. We at least did see some take that step forward in this Kentucky Oaks, particularly the winner, Pretty Mischievous, who had shown quality right along. I know you and I weren't sure that she was coming out of the best round of prep races at the fairgrounds, but she definitely moved forward. Maybe it was the addition of blinkers, because she definitely was pretty sharp in the early stages of this race and got a good ride despite drawing that outside 14 post. She was able to get over into the 3 to 4 path and was just the best horse in this race.
She was. She never didn't look like a winner during the race. She didn't have the greatest of trips, being wide most of the way, pressing a piece, which appeared pretty quick. And when you look at the chart, it would certainly reflect that with all the horses in behind her coming from further behind. I thought she ran well. She's going to wind up with a 114 TimeformUS speed figure, which is a pretty big jump over her best race. And I'd have to say, if you look back at the all the prep races, both male and female, it seems like Louisiana was the way to go.
Yeah, it kind of did play out that way. I mean, even the Alice Look, who I know you and I were a little bit interested in this race, off her big speed figure from back in January, she got back to that number here, finishing third. So definitely some strong form from those races, and Pretty Mischievous best on the day. Gambling Girl did make that late run to get into second. She got a very good trip and ride from Irad Ortiz, making that late push. And maybe that calls into question the quality of this race a little bit, because I don't think anybody was viewing Gambling Girl as being one of the best 3-year-old fillies out there, but at least they did run a faster speed figure in here, and that proved to be a problem for Wet Paint, who was the 8 to 5 favorite in here. Maybe she was a bit closer to the pace than some others imagined that she would be, but she just didn't have that late punch that we had seen from her in the Oaklawn prep races, and she was one of those that did not take that speed figure step forward, and she could do no better than fourth here.
No, and hey, a little credit here. I had Gambling Girl fourth, I think. But no, I
Yeah,
did not
that you
view
did.
her as I did not view her as one of the best. I just thought she overcame a slow pace to run pretty good at Aqueduct last time, and this time she got her pace. But it was good to see some of them take a jump forward. I would say this was still a below par Kentucky Oaks, even with the move forward that many of them made, and I'm still looking for some others to maybe come up that we haven't seen yet really hit the big stage. As a bettor and not the fan, I'm going to be looking to beat these horses going forward.
Well, we did see some other nice performances from 3-year-old fillies, from 3-year-old males, from horses in plenty of other divisions through these 2 days at Churchill Downs, and we're going to run through some of these undercard stakes now. Let's go back to Saturday, Craig, and we'll talk about the race right before the Derby and discuss all these Saturday undercard races. The Grade 1 Turf Classic, won by Up to the Mark, and I should probably put the Grade 1 in quotes, because this really wasn't the best Grade 1 turf race that we're going to see all year, but Up to the Mark, I thought he did put forth a Grade 1 worthy performance winning this race. I mean, it's not often that you see horses drawing off to win any graded stakes on the turf by nearly 4 lengths, and that's what Up to the Mark did here. He was just so much better than these horses, even covered ground around the turns. He was 3 wide most of the way and just mowed them down in the stretch. This is a really talented 4-year-old turf horse.
It is. I know we talked about him on this show a couple times when he was winning allowance races. We kind of knew he had stakes in his future. I'm not sure we saw him destroying a Grade 1 field. Now, granted, this wasn't the strongest race, as you say, for a Grade 1, but his 125 speed figure and the way he did it, He's a grade one horse in my opinion. He looked every bit the part, really strong, and the sky's the limit with this guy.
Yeah, he had run a sneaky good third in his prior race in that Maker's Mark, which was almost certainly a tougher event than this, and almost beating Modern Games on the wire that day. And the added distance probably worked to his benefit. I'll be interested to see where they decide to go with Up to the Mark next. Is he's the kind of horse that they stretch out to a mile and a quarter in a race like the Manhattan, being a Grade One? Maybe that's too tough to pass up, or do they view him as more of a miler? I'll be interested to see the route that they take with this horse, but he's definitely a real talent on the ground. Let's move on to the Grade 1 Churchill Downs, and kind of the same situation, Craig. A Grade 1 race maybe in name only with regard to the overall field quality, but the winner of the race, Cody's Wish, definitely deserving of that Grade 1 status. I mean, he was a heavy favorite in this race for good reason, wasn't beating a whole lot, but certainly did what you'd want to see a heavy favorite do, or win one in that fashion, overcoming a slow pace, drawing off so convincingly in the end, and earning a very nice TimeformUS speed figure.
Yeah, he ran a 128 speed figure. It was 130 final time. He gets that because the piece was just kind of moderate. It's coated in blue. I would say mostly that's because of how powerfully Cody's Wish finished. Had he not been in the race, it would just be noted as an average piece. But yeah, this horse is a good one. We hadn't seen him since he won the Breeders' Cup. The big question I have with him is just how far he can go, because he's clearly one of the best, if not the best, older horses out there.
Yeah, he really is, and it seems like the kind of horse that's going to have the Met Mile on his schedule next. We know a one-turn mile is absolutely perfect for him. He might have to beat a pretty tough rival that we're going to talk about a little later in this podcast, one that maybe others might not be rooting for in that race, but Cody's Wish definitely has the credentials to become that kind of horse. And I mean, he's now won 8 of his last 9. He's just in great form. He just seems to continue improving for Belmont, and it did produce one of the feel-good stories of this past weekend. I know that's been heavily covered on NBC with his namesake and being at the racetrack. And I mean, it's nice to keep bringing that up. I don't want to overshadow how talented this horse is, though, and I feel like sometimes on the national broadcast that doesn't always come across, that this was maybe the best horse that we saw running this past week, and he definitely put in one of his most electrifying performances to win this race. So very cool to see Cody's Wish come back in top form for this 2023 season.
Yeah, I did want to ask. I mean, nothing I see when I watch this horse run or when you look at his breeding would indicate he can't go further than what he's been doing. A mile and an eighth would certainly seem within his scope to me, maybe even further. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be a situation sort of like Life is Good last year. Even though he's a completely different sort of horse than Life is Good, the connections are going to have to ask themselves, is there really benefit to us in targeting the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile again? Is that going to really, increase his stud value? Or should we try to test this horse and maybe target a race like the Breeders' Cup Classic? I think a lot of people would have more confidence that a horse like Cody's Wish could do it than they would have that a runner like Life is Good, who was so headstrong. At least Cody's Wish seems to have that mental maturity to get a longer distance. We'll see if he has the physical ability to do so. But, we'll talk about some of the older horses a little bit later in that handicap division, Craig. Doesn't feel like it's the toughest year to take that chance. So I'll be interested to see if Bill Mott, after a race like the Met Mile, announces that they're going to target perhaps the Whitney and test his ability to go the mile and an eighth, and then maybe that opens some doors for the future. But it's an interesting question about Cody's Wish. Let's move on to the other Grade 1 that they ran on that Saturday card, the fourth Grade 1, I think it is, the Grade 1 Derby City Distaff, going that same 7 furlong distance, this one for the fillies and mares. And some frustration from the backers of the favorite in here, Craig, as Goodnight Olive did get stuck in that pocket behind Monterey and Wicked Halo in the stretch, and some might argue was cost the victory due to the tactics and the ride from Irad Ortiz. But I think some getting lost in that narrative is how well Matarea and Wicked Halo both ran. This was a really competitive race, and they're nice fillies, and I don't want to take anything away from them. The race was a lot closer than maybe people thought it would have been, that Goodnight Olive was even in that position. And sure, she was a little unlucky, but Matarea was a deserving winner of this race.
She was. She was very promising as a 3-year-old filly. Something went amiss. I think she was third in the test, if I remember right. And she went to the sideline. She came back with a good second behind Wicked Halo, who she faced here. Took another step forward off that layoff, and I thought she ran great. She totally earned it. I mean, the pace was pretty fast. We have both the opening fractions coded in red. She was pressing a long shot and travel column. Was able to take over and hold sway. And yeah, Goodnight Olive got blocked in, no doubt about it. And it was completely perfectly legal riding by Tyler Gaffalione to do so. Irad kind of got himself into that spot, couldn't get out. I think the upside was that's normally a spot where we might have seen Irad Ortiz force his way out, and he didn't do it here on the big stage. I was happy to see that. But I don't think it's a given that she was going to win that race. I mean, it's not like Monterey wasn't finishing it off. I thought she was running hard to the wire, and I would say it's more likely it cost Goodnight Olive second than it is the win.
I completely agree. I don't think there's any guarantee that Goodnight Olive was winning this race. And yes, she probably was cost a length, maybe a little bit more than that. But I don't know that she would have completely bridged that gap. And I think Irad Ortiz would have liked to bull his way out in the stretch there. But, I think one of the reasons that he got stuck in that pocket is if you've watched Goodnight Olive's last few races, she has a tendency to want to lug in. And you could see Irad really tugging hard on the right rein to trying to prevent her from doing that because he needed to angle out to get out of that pocket, but she was wanting to lug in towards the rail, and I think that made it even easier for Tyler Gaffalione to race ride her and keep her in that spot. So that's a bit of a concern with Goodnight Olive, especially when if they're gonna continue riding her from off the pace like they did here. And the reality of Goodnight Olive, Craig, is she's a horse that has gotten absolutely perfect trips twice in a row. I should say 3 times in a row if you go back to the Ballerina, and she finally faced a little bit of adversity and just wasn't quite good enough. And I think that Monterey and Wicked Halo, we already knew that they were really good horses, and maybe some people didn't quite believe how fast that Oaklawn prep had come back that they both raced in, but I think they confirmed that that speed figure was legitimate, and this division is a lot more competitive than just Goodnight Olive dominating these races. Let's move on to some other graded stakes action on this Saturday card. We'll stay with the one-turn dirt races for now and talk about the 3-year-olds in the Grade 2 Pat Day Mile. And this one, Craig, I would say produced a surprisingly high speed figure. Not that there wasn't some potential in this race, but I think it maybe looked like a chaotic, maybe somewhat disappointing affair, some rejects from the Triple Crown Trail that ended up in here, but we saw big step forwards from a few horses, including General Jim and Fort Bragg, the first 2 finishers, certainly 3-year-olds that seemed like they were well suited to this one-turn distance.
Yeah, this was a fast race. I don't think there's much doubt about it. I haven't mentioned it, but the Kentucky Derby Day, turf and dirt, was one of the easier days I'll ever have to make speed figures. I mean, it was just the worksheet, every race lined up perfect like you would think it would. And this one came out with the top 2 running a 121, which is a big jump for both of them. It was a good, strong race, I thought. And I think it just kind of points to maybe a lot of these horses just aren't cut out for the Derby distances. And this is what they really want all along, 7 furlongs a mile. You can't blame for Connections for trying to go longer, but yeah, because that's where the big money is. But there's still a lot of pretty good horses out there. And I think some of these horses are going to be dangerous moving forward this year, particularly in one-term races, because this was a strong one.
Yeah, I know both you and I discounted General Jim a little bit, but Shug McGahee, a trainer that's always willing to take his time, and that the time off definitely benefited this horse. He could have chosen to come back sooner and try to push this horse into a final round Derby prep, but he elected to instead target this Pat Day Mile after he came up sick and missed the Fountain of Youth, and it really paid off in the end because General Jim took a big step forward coming off the layoff here, and it'll be interesting to see what these horses do. I mean, I guess the natural next step for a lot of these would be a race like the Grade 1 Woody Stevens turning back. I don't know if the connections of General Jim have intentions to stretch him out in the future. He's a horse that has won going 2 turns on the turf in the past, so maybe that's a door that could be open to him. But we definitely saw some big steps forward from the 3-year-olds this weekend in this race and in the Kentucky Derby. So it might just be the time of year that we're seeing a lot of these horses start to reach their full potential.
Yeah, and I'm glad I meant to mention Chug McGahee. I talked about earlier, I've been following this game for 40 years. And one of the things I've been doing almost that whole time is underrating Chug McGahee.
Yeah, he's a trainer that often has a long-term plan, and when you see it come to fruition, you often can't be surprised with him at the helm. Let's move on to some turf racing. The Grade 2 American Turf, also run for the 3-year-olds, took place a little earlier on this Churchill Downs Saturday card. And Craig, this race looked so strong on paper on the way in. I mean, it still turned out to be a strong race, even though there was a big upset winner. It did lose a little bit in the moments leading up to this race with the late scratch of Talk of the Nation. I'm sure there was hypervigilance to any horse that wasn't looking absolutely 100% on Saturday, and for whatever reason, the on-track veterinarian decided to scratch Talk of the Nation at the gate. I don't want to be too critical of that. I mean, I suppose the reasons could have been reported a little bit better because it was a very late scratch, but if we're going to prioritize horse safety in this game, I think these are things that we just kind of have to accept and roll with the punches of some horses that we like or want to bet on getting scratched in the late stages right up to, in the lead up to a race. So that was unfortunate because I think a lot of people viewed him as one of the top contenders in this race, but there was still a lot of quality in here. And Webslinger, the horse that got the upset victory, a horse that, we had mentioned in our stakes preview, had gotten a wide trip in a couple of races recently, maybe was better than he looks. I know neither you or I landed on him in this race, but I mean, there were some things to like about him, and he certainly came through with the best performance he's put forth to date.
Yeah, what was I surprised me was the trip he was able to work out from the 14 post. I thought it was a great ride by Javier Castellano. Webslinger ran great. He got a 117 speed figure, took a step forward, but he's been running some good races all along, as you said. He was just overshadowed by some other more reputation horses, horses like Major Dude and Farbridge, even Carl Spackler, who had been running well and running fast. And for the most part, those horses showed up, and Webslinger was just able to beat him anyway. So I still think this is a very strong 3-year-old division. To see these kind of speed figures, the winner got a 117, the top 4 all got 116 or 117. We usually don't see that from 3-year-olds on the turf this early. So it's a strong division. I will say the scratch, I have no problems with the horse being scratched. It definitely should have been reported a little better. Nothing was said on the broadcast, and let's not... that's how 99% of the people are probably watching, because other than if you go to the track feed, there's really no other way to see it. And I thought it was handled pretty poorly that way, not letting people know and really not giving anyone any time to adjust to that late scratch.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, you don't want to forget there's a lot of money being bet on this game on a day like the Kentucky Derby, and you do want to recognize that. I mean, while also prioritizing horse safety, you do want to, do the bettors the favor of letting them know all of the information around that, including that the horse is actually out of the race. So I completely agree with you on that. And yeah, I mean, I thought we saw a lot of nice performances in this race. I mean, Farbridge got a great got a great ride and trip from Joel Rosario. It was a tough weekend for Joel, some really tough trips. I thought this was one of the better rides that he gave, just saving ground on this horse, and came up on the unlucky side of a head bop at the very end. The horse that maybe was most unlucky in this race was the number 5, Johannes, who just got continually shuffled back after the start. I don't think too many people would have projected that he would be last of 13 horses heading to the half-mile pole, and he did make up a lot of ground at the end trying to weave his way through traffic. He's a really talented horse that I think is going to have his day in one of these big races eventually, but he's going to have to get off to a better start and not have that early trouble.
Yeah, like I said, I stick by it. This is a very, very strong group. I imagine they'll disperse a little bit now, and we will see some more very strong 3-year-old turf performances going forward. And it's probably the first time I can ever say I'm really looking forward to that Naira Turf Triple Crown.
Talk about some races from earlier in the day at Churchill on Saturday. The Grade 2 Distaff Turf Mile for the fillies and mares. Spenderella went off as the big favorite here coming off the layoff, and maybe the pace just got a little too quick for her because she came up lacking in the final stages and found herself vulnerable to one of the 3 Chad Brown trainees in this race, Fluffy Socks. I know Fluffy Socks was ridden by Irad Ortiz, Craig, so I guess that has something to do with the price, but I was a little surprised that she took the most money of the 3 Chad Brown trainees in here, and it proved to be smart money because she was the one that got the job done.
Yeah, and she's a filly who very rarely has gotten the job done of late. She's had a whole bunch of seconds and thirds and fourths in her PPs while always running well. But I think Irad Ortiz just worked out a nice trip. As you said, the pace maybe got a little hot. We don't have any of the fractions coded, but the early pace figures from Haughty were in the 130 range. So it was borderline fast pace, and I think that was probably by design with Chad Brown's other two horses being come from behind types, and it probably worked to the detriment of Spenderella. Not saying it was anything nefarious, but if you have three of the six horses, you're going to try to do different things with them, and I think it worked to design well here. And Fluffy Socks ran well, 122 Timeform US figure, same as Spenderella, who certainly lost nothing in defeat off the long layoff.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's just to be expected. I mean, I didn't see any riding to try to beat Spenderella in this race. It's not, as you said, it's not like the pace was, extremely fast. I mean, they were just going an honest clip, and Haughty, who was setting the pace, which, kind of where I expected her to be based on her previous win. I mean, she just turned out to not be good enough, and maybe her collapsing helped the entire pace to collapse a little bit and allowed Fluffy Socks to get into the race. And Fluffy Socks, like you said, a nice horse, doesn't always get the job done, but was able to have her day in the sun here. So we'll see if she could have a little more winning in her future after this. The Grade 2 Twin Spires Turf Sprint produced the biggest upset that we saw on this Saturday card, as No Balls got the job done. It was able to get clear on the front end early, something that I was a little surprised by, that there was one horse that was able to just kind of run this field off its feet for the first quarter mile. But you could see watching the replay, he got really comfortable on the lead, not being pressed, and nobody else could get into this race.
Yeah, there's that. That was pretty much the race in a nutshell. Once this horse got clear, he had some fast races, and he showed when he makes a clear lead, he's able to run fast figures. He had run a 115 over this very track last year as a June 3-year-old. So the big jump that he took here, even though he was a huge long shot, looking back, it wasn't like it came out of nowhere. This horse was quick, and I don't have a whole lot to add to it. I wasn't smart enough to bet him, but he certainly had those races in his past performances if you accounted for the fact that he's now almost a year removed from when he ran those big races.
Yeah, big effort from No Balls. Some trips in behind. There were some rough portions of this race. Big Invasion just got a really tough trip and not the ride that I think a lot of his supporters were hoping to see. Just multiple spots of trouble. I think he's a horse that if he runs back in the Grade 1 Jaipur at Belmont, a lot of people will be on him as a trip bet back from this race. So something to keep in mind. Definitely a race that you want to go back and watch. And the final race we'll talk about from the Saturday card, and really, the speed figures were so high across the board, we could have discussed every single race on this card, but we'll mention one of the non-stakes events, the first race of the day, won by the very promising 3-year-old Federal Judge, who in just the second start of his career got a 1:14 Timeform US speed figure and beating Extra Anejo, who was coming back off the long layoff here, and both of these horses seem like there are some promising runners for the second half of the season.
Yeah, Extra Nejo had run that monster 119 Timeform US speed figure in his debut back in October. I assume something went amiss that we weren't seeing him until now, and maybe he wasn't fully cranked up for this spot. Maybe they weren't expecting to run into a horse like Federal Judge, because he's a good one. He improved off his 111 first time out all the way up to a 114. I say all the way up, it's only 3 points, but it's a nice forward solid move for a horse who seems like he'd be able to go at least a little bit further. I don't know if he's got 2 turns in his future, but I could see him being a 7 furlong 1 turn mile type horse.
Yeah, I mean, I have to imagine horses like this will join some of the Pat Day Mile runners in a race like the Woody Stevens. And I say hopefully, because you'd want to see all these quality horses converge in the Grade 1 races. And that would seem like a logical next step, especially for Extra Anejo, who I know they probably want to go longer with him eventually, just based on his pedigree. He seems like a horse that is going to get added ground, but second off the layoff, I don't know if you want to ask too much of this horse, and he was off to a little bit of a slow start here, had to play catch up, so you don't know how hard this race was on him, so we'll see what they do with him after this, but definitely some quality runners in these races, as well as some others later in the card that we're not going to talk about, but definitely some promising 3-year-olds out there for the latter half of this 2023 season. Let's move on to the Friday card, Craig, because there are also plenty of stakes races there that we should mention, including one of the highest speed figures from this past weekend, which came in the Grade 2 Ali Sheba, the first stakes race that they ran between this 2-day period, Friday and Saturday, Oaks and Derby Day. And we saw Smile Happy, who I know we were kind of scratching our heads as to why Ken McPeak ran him back just 2 weeks after his return at Oaklawn Park in that 1-mile race, but I think he knew what he was doing because he probably had this race circled on the calendar, and even though Smile Happy didn't run up to his full potential that day, certainly primed him to take a step forward here, and boy did he take a step forward to beat this quality field.
Yeah, I remember him saying he was a horse who just won't work out, so they figure they might as well race him, and it sure seemed to get him fit for this spot. He ran a 124 Timeform US speed figure for the win. Very, very solid. Not quite up to the level we saw from Cody's Wish at a different distance, but good strong effort from this one. This was a grade 2. That's the kind of figure he ran. I think it was a little more disappointing for some of the other horses in the field, particularly Art Collector and West Willpower, who I don't think had a whole lot of excuses. They were both right there with him on a pace which was pretty moderate, and Smile Happy was able to just outfinish them.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be too hard on Smile Happy, the winner. 124 is a solid number, and the final time figure is a 128, I think. So that's a really respectable number for the older horses that we're seeing in this division right now. So, I mean, he's definitely towards the top of that list. I agree with you. Art Collector and especially West Willpower were a little disappointing in this race. West Willpower setting that slow pace, had everything go his way, and kind of reverted to the West Willpower that we had grown accustomed to towards the end of last year, when he would get these great trips and just not quite seal the deal. And the same thing once again, not a bad race from him by any stretch of the imagination, but just not taking the kind of step forward, even repeating that breakout performance that we had seen from him in his prior start at Fairgrounds. So, we're not seeing the consistency that you'd want to see from the top runners in this older horse division, but we are seeing some competitive races, and that's what we got here with Smile Happy getting the job done. And I don't know, Craig, if a horse like Smile Happy or Art Collector matched up against Cody's Wish later in the year, I'm not sure who I'd prefer, but I certainly would be fascinated to see it play out on the racetrack.
Yeah, it's one of those things. Everybody just seems to take turns beating each other, which tells you it's probably not the strongest group you're ever going to see among the older horses, but it will be fun for the betting. And I know we're a little pressed for time, but I have to mention Rich Strike. What do you do with him at this point? I know his first race off of a layoff since the Breeders' Cup, maybe a little too short, but he did no running at all.
I don't want to be too hard on Rich Strike. Obviously, there have been some setbacks. I mean, they were planning to run him multiple times before this, and they finally made their appearance here. The way that the pace of this race worked out, he never had a chance. Not that he did any running. I mean, he went backwards in the stretch and was under a hard ride from a long way out, but I would imagine there are better performances and better races for Rich Strike in the future than this one. So I'm not going to just judge him off this performance, because he did run other good races last year after the Kentucky Derby. He's not a bad horse. I'm skeptical he'd be able to get back to the top of this division as it currently stands, but this was not the right situation for him. Let's move on to the only other Grade 1 race that they ran on Friday at Churchill Downs. That was the La Troyenne for the fillies and mares. And we saw a bit of an upset here as Secret Oath, who was coming off those two excellent performances at Oaklawn Park, wheeling back on relatively short rest just 3 weeks after the Apple Blossom, and just didn't quite run up to the standard that we had seen from her in those two prior races, not able to reel in the very game played hard in the late stages here. A bit of a speed figure regression, and just not looking quite as sharp as we had seen Secret Oath at Oaklawn.
No, and I think that was a concern. I know I had it as somebody that handicapped this race, that she was coming back in just 3 weeks. And not necessarily that it was 3 weeks, just that it was such a tough race she was coming out of in the Apple Blossom, with a big duel with down the lane through Clairiere with that last furlong. And it just seemed like that race had to have taken something out of her, and the speed figures reflected it here as she dropped from a couple 120s down to a 115. Didn't get the greatest trip either. I mean, I know they tend to exaggerate how wide horses are at Secret Oath, at Churchill Downs. I'm not sure they did with Secret Oath. She was pretty wide on the second turn and even wider in the stretch, so maybe you can give her a bit of an excuse there, but it just seemed like she wasn't on her A game. And Play Hard was the horse who was one of the horses who was most likely to take advantage in that scenario because she always seems to show up and run a race. It's never like a grade one type race for the most part, and the figure came back just a 116. So not really a grade one type figure, but she was opportunistic, and her connections get the grade one win here.
Yeah, and Secret Oath is the kind of horse that she's had a history of not really finishing off her races that strongly. I mean, she'll get there in mid-stretch and then just hang a little bit. She'll stall. Even in her victories, she'll make that big move to the eighth pole and then just sort of get there on class at the very end. But, we saw it happen in the Apple Blossom where she made that big move to take over the lead and then found herself wanting in the late stages to Clairiere. And I think we saw a very similar situation here where she got there like, she should have rolled by in mid-stretch and just she hung a little bit in the late stages of that race. And I think that's a concern for Secret Oath, that it makes her one of the more difficult horses to ride. And, Craig, the thing that you just said sort of harkens back to that conversation we were having earlier in the podcast. Coming back in just 3 weeks, a lot of people were concerned about that, kind of expecting her to regress, and indeed she did. And I think that just speaks to the fact that there's this disconnect. I mean, we can't say that we want these horses to continue running back on short rest and then still expect them to run their races. I mean, Dwayne Lucas, one of the few trainers that still does that, and it's fair to say most horse players don't exactly expect consistency out of Dwayne Lucas trainees anymore. So, I think you have to weigh both sides of that argument.
Yeah, no doubt. It's definitely one of those things. We've talked about it plenty, but it was certainly a handicapping factor here. So you can't use it in one direction and then ignore it in another spot.
The 8 Bells, grade 2 event for the going 7 furlongs for the 3-year-old fillies, did produce another upset as Money's Gold took all the money in this race, unsurprisingly off her big speed figure victory at Tampa Bay Downs in her prior start. But Craig, Red Carpet Ready, a horse that a little underrated coming into this race. I know I had spoken a lot about how she was against a dead rail in her prior race at Gulfstream Park. I know I had mentioned it a couple times on this podcast, and she was one of the ones that I think I had said going back to that Forward Gal that I think the Devona Dale rather, that I was really looking forward to betting her back in the next spot, and finally got the chance here. And I loved the ride that Luis Saez gave her because he didn't just ride like he was going to settle for second. He took it to Money's Gold early and really tried to beat this favorite, and it worked out.
I totally agree. Money's Gold, obviously a very fast filly. When you look at her TimeformUS PPs in those first 3 runaway wins, you see a whole lot of blue fractions in races where she didn't really have any competition. And this spot where she finally faced a legitimate stakes runner, and no doubt Red Carpet Ready is that. She's a very good sprinter who I think we're going to hear a lot from. She progressed her speed figure quite a bit in here, all the way up to a 112 off that against the bias 103 last time. And Money's Gold regressed. There's no simple way to say it, no simpler way to say it. Facing some competition, I think it got to her a little bit, and she didn't have that same kick in the lane. I saw some criticism of Irad Ortiz saying they didn't use Money's Gold speed and should have opened up, but I just don't think that was going to happen without it being a suicidal pace. I thought she was running fine. She set a solid pace, and just the best horse was able to get her at the end.
Yeah, I mean, you could see it in the TimeformUS pace figures. I mean, it's not like he tried to get some breather. Red Carpet Ready just kind of made this mid-race move to push her, and she almost paid the price at the very end because Red Carpet Ready was getting very leg-weary in the final 8th or 16th of a mile of this race. She almost came back to Money's Gold. But, I mean, I think that's the price that Luis Saez paid, or the fine line he was trying to walk by pushing Money's Gold just hard enough to discourage her, while also making sure that he had enough in the tank to actually win the race, and he timed it just right. But both of these fillies are talented, and they each ran well. Let's move on to the race that got one of the biggest speed figures of this past week from you, Craig. The Grade 3 Modesty on the turf for the fillies and mares, won by the Argentine-bred Didia, who has now won 7 races in a row, all 4 of her starts in the U.S. And, I mean, I don't know where this filly ceiling is ultimately going to be, but she just keeps winning.
Yeah, she's very good, and she's showing that she's able to do it in different ways. She has good tactical speed. She's laid close a couple times. She's come from further back a couple times, and she just was much the best in this field. The speed figures, like I said, they were pretty easy for the card. It was a little pause for me because especially with the runner up coming up so fast, also getting a 126, but. Didia is very good. She seems like she's the best horse in the division right now, and I look forward to seeing her get challenged. I'm just not sure who that's going to come from right now.
Yeah, I mean, the figure does seem a little high to me, the 126, just looking at the other horses in this race. But I will say, even though this was a grade 3 and the Distaff Turf Mile from the day after was a grade 2, kind of feels like the Modesty was the stronger race. So I don't have a big problem with that race getting a bigger speed figure. And the win, I mean, the number, it makes some sense for the trajectory of Didia, and I'll be interested to see what they do with her. I mean, because this division, you kind of have to go one way or the other, targeting the mile races or eventually stretching out and targeting a race like the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Turf. And I don't doubt that she would have the versatility to go longer. She just kind of gets in that fight in the final eighth and always finds the wire first. So, I mean, she's a really likable horse, and I'll be interested to see where they go with her next. We saw another nice performance from Caravel, another older filly or mare in the unbridled Sydney. Big favorite in this race. I guess they could have decided to run against the males again in the Twin Spires turf sprint, but they're probably saving those attempts against the boys for the Grade 1 races later in the year, and they took the softer route here, and she just asserted her dominance over this group.
Yeah, not a whole lot to say about this race. It was definitely a major drop down in class off her last win against the males, and she was able to get the job done. She ran the same speed figure, a 120, and you could see the difference. I thought the runner-up Bay Storm ran just fine, but just not in the same league as Caravel.
And then the one other stakes that we'll discuss from that Friday card, the Grade 2 Edgewood for the 3-year-old fillies on the turf, the counterpart to Saturday's American Turf. And we saw this race wired on the front end by the Brad Cox trained Heavenly Sunday, a horse that was coming off a decent third place finish in the Appalachian in her prior start and was able to better that result this time by just getting that favorable front running trip.
Yeah, it's a race where, I mean, that's what it was. She got to the rail, set the pace. She's a horse who had been progressing speed figure wise and took another small move forward. And she already had similar speed figures to everybody else in here. She got a 109 for the win. Um, just the best horse. I don't know if she's always going to need things her own way. She seems like one who maybe has some more tactical speed, could rate off of it a little bit. So I don't want to write it off that she just stole it on the front end. I think she's actually pretty good. The only other filly I really wanted to mention in here was Papilio. I know she's a horse you've pointed out many times wants to get in, and it cost her. And I think it did here. Maybe she wasn't winning anyway, but you could really see the rider Javier Castellano fighting with her, trying to keep her straight, and it just sapped any late kick that she was going to have. And in the end, she was still only beaten a length.
Yeah, the one other horse I want to mention from this race is the number 6 Mission of Joy, who I think should have won this race. Just gotten a few spots of trouble. Look, I don't want to be too hard on Joel Rosario. I know I made a tweet about him on I think Saturday, just kind of questioning because I mean we've seen this happen a lot this year, and I mean I think I'm happy to see there's been more of a dialogue about the mindset of a jockey, and maybe I should have contextualize my tweet a little better, but you never know what somebody's going through, and sometimes this could be a real mental game. And a jockey that was at the top of things a couple of years ago, I mean, things can change very easily, and your timing can go if your head isn't in the right place. And I mean, I don't want to just blindly criticize somebody without putting it in that context around how hard it is to be a jockey. And it just seems like something's not clicking with Joel the way that it has in the past. And you could see it on this ride of Mission of Joy. I mean, he's had so much finesse with these off the pace horses in the past and making that move out at the right time to find a path, and it just wasn't happening with this horse or with a few others that we saw this weekend. So I mean, he's so naturally talented. I hope that it can kind of click back into place for him, but it's not right now.
Yeah, I have no look. It's a gambling game. It pays to know who's riding well and who's not. It's nothing personal when we say a rider's not riding well. more than it's a athlete in any other sport isn't performing up to the capability we've seen. And it's been a fairly long-term thing with Joel Rosario. He's not riding at the level he did even a year ago.
Let's move on to a couple other tracks, Craig, and we don't want to spend too much more time because I know we're already, creating a longer than usual Pacecast here, though I guess Derby Week does merit that. But there was some nice racing going on at Belmont Park opening week of that meet, and I mean, I want to mention it because it's been a long time since we've been at Belmont Park, obviously having that Belmont at the Big A meet or at Belmont and Aqueduct meet from the end of last year when they typically would run at Belmont, so it's been almost a year, and we saw a few graded stakes run between Friday and Saturday. The biggest speed figure that was awarded was on Friday's feature in the Grade 3 Westchester, the local prep for the Grade 1 Met Mile, and Repo Rocks, Craig, had run that gigantic speed figure in the toboggan over the winter at Aqueduct. It looked maybe like he had gone the wrong way for Jamie Ness when he had lost the Carter, but the best version of Repo Rocks came back out here as he was able to dominate this field that included the third place finish from last year's Derby, Zandon.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to say about Repo Rocks. He looked terrible last time to me. I can't figure out how he got second in that race. Turns around and rebounds back to a 129 speed figure here. We've discussed him plenty in the past. I know we both have our reservations about how this horse has suddenly became a graded stakes winner. Um, I don't know. I don't know the answers. It's frustrating, and personally, I don't believe it's real. I'll leave it at that. Zandon, I thought he ran well. It was his first start of the year. He's a horse who I think this one turn mile is probably going to be his best distance. I thought it was a promising return off the layoff. He just ran into a horse that he wasn't able to beat.
Yeah, I thought Zandon ran fine. I mean, you do eventually want to see this horse get back to the winner's circle because he now hasn't won since last year's Bluegrass. And I mean, he's been in some tough spots, but you want to see him start to win again. I don't know if a mile is going to be his best or if he's going to want to go longer. I mean, we did see him hang a little bit in the late stages of a few races last year, so I think that's the thinking behind turning him back, but I'll be interested to see what they do with Zandon. Maybe there'll be some temptation to run the Met Mile because it's up next on the schedule, but he's a horse that I think I'd like to see stretch out again a little bit later in the year. The other graded stakes from that Friday card was the Grade 2 Sheepshead Bay. This one going the mile and 3/8 distance, or I should say the about mile and 3/8 distance on the inner turf course. And just a field of four signed on here. Two from the Chad Brown stable, two from the Christophe Clement stable. That's not something we really want to see more of in this sport, but that's the way this race played out. And there really just looked like there was one speed on paper, and that was Higher Truth. And she got to the front end. I don't really trust the fractions in this race or know how fast they were actually going, but it certainly looked like they were just in a canter early, and then she sprinted to the wire, and nobody could catch her.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. That I don't have a whole lot to say about the race. It was a merry-go-round. She gets a 122 speed figure. If it means anything, I have no idea. She's probably not going to encounter circumstances like this. The times you can't really pay any attention to them. I actually didn't even bother making speed figures for this race because I think it's the first time they ever have run with this about distance with this rail setting, and it's just a waste of time to even try. For some reason, Aqueduct or Belmont has this, they've decided that they couldn't use rail settings they've always used in the past, and they've expanded it even wider, but they didn't bother putting in timing eyes for these races. So they're basically running at a 35-foot rail, but timing it using the 27-foot rail settings, which means the times are all wrong. At some distances, I can still make figures because they run them often enough that even though the times are wrong, they're at least consistent. But in this race, there was nothing to compare it to.
On Saturday at Belmont, they also ran a pair of graded stakes races, including the Grade 2 Fort Marcy. This one, going the mile and an eighth distance on the turf, was won by the Charlie Appleby-trained, Godolphin-owned Ottoman Fleet, who came over from Europe for this race. He was coming off a victory at Newmarket in his prior start, had also raced in Dubai over the winter, and not a horse that I think has been talked about as one of the best Godolphin horses out there, but he's been a really solid performer overseas. And these Charlie Appleby runners have proven very dangerous when they come to the U.S. in the past, and this one was just too classy for his foes.
Yeah, that's you pretty much summed it up. I don't have a whole lot to add. He was the best in here. He ran a 123 Timeform US speed figure, and that's a race that's going to make him pretty competitive with just about everybody in the states right now in the older horse division.
Yeah, I think the jockey had mentioned that, he's the kind of horse that they're looking maybe at some other targets in the U.S. You'd imagine that since he's here, they would probably consider running him the Grade 1 Manhattan. That would make a lot of sense. And he's a horse that definitely gets 10 furlongs. So maybe a more competitive race than Up to the Mark ran in the Turf Classic if they decide to go that route and run into this horse in the Manhattan. But you want to see these Grade 1s come up very competitive affairs. So I would hope to see both of them show up in that spot. And then the other race that we'll mention from Saturday at Belmont was the Grade 2 Ruffian. A real breakout performance here, Craig, from the winner past the Champagne. A runner who people might remember was a very good 3-year-old. I think she had just lost in the Ashland in a close decision, then was off for a long time. I think just raced once during her 4-year-old season, had a lot of trouble getting back to the races consistently. And even earlier this year when she came back for her 5-year-old season, not at her best right off the bat, but seems like George Weaver has her going in the right direction now.
Yeah, she ran to me surprisingly high 118 speed figure in the win. I mean, she had some back races that would point to that. In her last trip at Laurel, she was in a race where she had basically no chance given the race flow with a very slow pace and a fast finish. But in this one, she was more forwardly placed, was able to sit right there, and she just powered through in the lane and looked really good doing it. She's one who I don't think this performance was any kind of fluke. I think she's going to be moving forward, one we're going to have to deal with this summer.
Yeah, and I know she's a horse that they've tried sprint distances with, but I actually like her going a mile and a 16th, and I wonder if we'll take a shot in a race like the Ogden Phipps. I mean, that's a race that tends to come up with a small field. Why not? I mean, maybe Secret Oath isn't in the best form anymore. I mean, Claire here obviously is going to be a formidable presence in that race, and who knows if Nest is going to make her return, but the form that she's in right now, this is one you want to strike, especially with a horse that's had some trouble staying on the racetrack in the past.
Yeah, I mentioned Shug McGahee earlier, and one I can never figure out. Speaking of can't figure out, but he's got to be pulling his hair out with Kathleen O. She's just a filly who I can't get it. I mean, I can get a handle on her. You just keep betting against her because bettors seem to love her, but she just isn't winning any races, and she really didn't show up on Saturday.
Yeah, big step in the wrong direction for her. And before we wrap up the podcast, Craig, we'll just mention one more race that I know you had reminded me of that actually happened last week, and that was the Lake Hamilton at Oaklawn. I think it was actually closing day at Oaklawn when Skelly, who has really been a star sprinter from this season in Arkansas, won this race. Obviously not against the strongest field of sprinters that he's going to meet this year, and I guess Steve Asmussen wanted to keep him at 6 furlongs here rather than target a race like the Grade 1 at Churchill going 7, but you'd have to imagine they're going to try the top sprint races in the country after this.
Yeah, I would think. I think you're probably right in that maybe he thinks 6 furlongs is the best distance for this horse, and I wouldn't really argue with him. He would have run into Cody's Wish, which I don't think would have turned out very well for him, but he's obviously very fast. We've talked about how fast he gets out of the gate. He won this race, I think, even a little easier than it looks. It looked like he was maybe going to get challenged in the stretch, and when the rider got into him, he just pulled back away. Speed figure is lowest yet of his last several, where he only got a 122 this time after higher figures in the last couple. But I think he's still very sharp and a horse who's going to be very dangerous in any 6 furlong stake. And even if he tries longer, he's going to make things very tough on any other front runner.
Yeah, he's a really talented, fast horse. And, Steve Asmussen has targeted races like the Grade 1 Vanderbilt at Saratoga with runners like this in the past, so you'd have to imagine that's the long-term goal for Skelly. Well, that brings us to the end of the rundown this week, Craig, as we've recapped all these races. And I'll say I feel better, as I often do, after talking to you on this podcast about these races. As maybe you could tell from my sort of lackluster intro this week, I wasn't really looking forward to recording today. I was just, as you said, sort of burnt out and just kind of, had that Derby hangover, so to speak, from last week. Just, really exhausted after putting a lot of work in, and then, having the coverage around the Derby be so negative and some of the discussions. It just kind of weighs down on you. And I sort of wasn't looking forward to recording today, but, talking through through these issues and talking about some of these performances, it's put me in a better mood and has me looking forward more than I was.
Well, I'm glad I was able to help with that. I try to stay optimistic and everything. I mean, I love horse racing and I want what's best for the game. And it wasn't a great weekend, no matter how you want to color it. All you got to do is turn on the news or the TV and see that the coverage was negative. But there's nothing you can do about what actually happened in the past. You can just do your best to make sure it doesn't happen going forward. Or in this case, as we discussed, you're never going to totally eliminate horse deaths, but let's do what's best for the horses. And I think deep down, that's what everyone wants, no matter how hardcore of a gambler you are. There's plenty of things you can gamble on. We all love the horse side of things, and we want what's best for the animals because I think most of us, we like to bet on the races, but we're also big fans of the game.
Very well said, Craig. Well, Craig and I will, of course, be back for our usual podcast schedule this week after just doing the one podcast last week. We'll be recording a TimeformUS forecast a little later. Haven't yet decided what we're going to handicap, but there are some different stakes being run around the country, so we'll see what we decide on. But everybody, remember, you can always catch these TimeformUS podcasts on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Again, everybody, thanks for tuning in this week, and make sure to catch our TimeformUS forecast coming up later in the week.